up to the leaders of those companies to assess the situation, look at the pros and the cons, look at their business and business model to see what decision they want to make. And you have seen the decision that Renault has made. Other activities have decided to stop doing business. I feel that our priority should be the final outcome. And the final outcome that we want is to put an end to Russia's action. So that is the position of France. Now, over the long run, my sense is that those decisions will need to be reassessed because when the company decides to stop its business in Russia, it is leaving behind workers and other people who continue to be in Russia. So what is the impact on the country? Is it really worse for the leaders in that country? I don't know. That is a question I have. It means that in that case, Russian capital will be taking over this profitability. So I think that we need to be coherent and consistent. Renault made a decision, and the French state, as a shareholder, did not object to this decision. It was one which was in line with its strategy, and it was done on the basis of an understanding of the situation for that company. Jérôme Rivel from AFP. Let me return to the NATO summit. Do you think that NATO should provide unrestricted military aid as requested by President Zelensky? And if so, do you think that France should be increasing the weapons it supplies to Ukraine? I know that you want to be quite discreet about this, but other nations are less so. And in the summit, have you agreed on red lines in terms of the use of chemical weapons? Well, about your first question, there is a limit, which is that we don't want to become a warring party. This is a limit which is shared by all. So supplying more equipment such as planes or tanks, well, that would be characterized as us becoming a warring party. However, when it comes to some weapons, they have been delivered since the beginning of the war, and that will continue to be the case. Others are continuing to implement contracts which were signed before the beginning of the war, and as such are continuing to help Ukraine. So we have said that we would continue this kind of effort. We would have the same consistency and the same limitations. And I think that that is what makes it possible for this approach to be sustainable over the long run. Now, turning to your second question, I want to be very cautious about that. Firstly, because as far as I'm concerned, anytime I had to define red lines, I wanted to be perfectly sure that defining these red lines would have a deterrent effect, and that the fact that these red lines not being respected would lead to consequences. I think that that is the way France's word will be respected. That is what we did in April 2018 with the Hamilton operation. Now, I think that in this situation, strategic ambiguity and discretion are more effective. So I will stick to that. We are working, we are preparing things, but I will not be more explicit about any kind of red lines on this matter. Are there other questions? Rama Rajdi from USPA.
Mr. President. Sorry. Je voulais poser une question plus par rapport à la mediation.
I had a question about negotiation and peace, even though we are in a more military venue here. So yesterday, President Zelensky, when he spoke to, or before the French Parliament, talked about the Normandy format as a peace table, and that it had provided some kind of breathing room for a few years. And he was saying that now he was in need of something more than just that. Now, bearing in mind that President Putin has now ripped the Minsk agreements to shreds, and I hope I'll be able to express my idea adequately here, says the speaker, but President Zelensky had said that he had
avant
hoped that
l'attaque
the
et la
U.S.
guerre.
would be
Est-ce que vous pensez
a
qu'aujourd'hui,
party
c'est
to
le
the
moment
Normandy format before the war began. But do you think that now
d'inclure
the time has come
les États-Unis,
to include the
puisqu'ils
United
sont de
States
fait maintenant dans les
because of
négociations,
the de
depuis
facto
que Joe
situation
Biden a rencontré Poutine
with the meeting between
juin
Joe
l'an
Biden
dernier, et
and
aussi
President
depuis
Putin
la conférence qu'il a eue
last
aussi l'an
June,
dernier,
as well as the
et que
conference that
c'était dans
took
les
place
tuyaux,
last
entre
year?
guillemets. Je sais pas si
Was
c'est...
all of this in the
Vous pouvez
pipeline? Is this something
peut-être
which
me
was
donner
being
un
considered?
éclaircissement?
Could you perhaps shed a bit of light on that?
Je distinguerai d'abord deux cadres qui ont
Well, let
toujours
me
été distincts.
distinguish two different
Il y a un
frameworks.
cadre qui
First of
était
all, there is
ce qui, avant le 24 février,
there is
s'appelait la crise ukrainienne, qui est maintenant la
the
guerre ukrainienne,
framework
qui
which
était en
up
effet celui
until
des accords
February
de Minsk et du
24th
format de
was
Normandie.
the Ukrainian crisis, and now it has
Ça, c'est
become
un
the
cadre.
Ukrainian
Et
war
ensuite,
in
les
Ukraine,
discussions
and that is the
bilatérales
Normandy format. And then there are
prévalaient entre les
bilateral
États-Unis
discussions,
d'Amérique
the
et la
bilateral
Russie. C'est un
discussions that
autre
took
cadre.
place
Les
between
sujets, d'ailleurs, n'étaient pas les
the
mêmes.
US and Russia. And that is a
discussions
different
de juin
framework.
dernier
There were different
à
topics.
Genève étaient
Back
des
in June
discussions
in
sur
Geneva,
la
the
sécurité,
talks
les
were
relations
about
bilatérales,
security,
le
were about
contrôle des
bilateral
armements.
relations, and were about
Et
arms
puis, il y
control.
a d'autres discussions
But then there
pour
are
lesquelles
other
la France a toujours plaidé, je
discussions, and
continuerai de le
France has
faire,
always been in favor
qui
of those, and I will
doivent
continue to be in favor of those.
prévaloir.
There are
Celle
other
entre l'OTAN et la
discussions which need
Russie,
to
il y
take
a
place, that is, those
un accord qui
between
existe, même si
NATO and
il a
Russia. There is
été
an
là
agreement,
aussi foulé aux pieds par
even
la
though,
Russie
of
de
course,
manière
that one has
unilatérale.
been
Il y a des
violated by
discussions
Russia
qui devront se tenir à
unilaterally.
un moment entre l'Union
And then
européenne et
there
la
are
Russie, parce
discussions
qu'on
which will
parle
need to take place
de
between the
l'Union
EU
européenne,
and
de
Russia,
notre sol, de
because
nos
we're talking
équilibres.
about the EU, we're talking
Et
about
moi,
our
je ne
territory, we're
délègue pas
talking
les
about our
discussions sur ma
balances,
sécurité.
and I won't delegate discussions
Ça, ce sont
about
des cadres
our
différents.
security. So those are different
Aujourd'hui,
frameworks.
il n'y a plus de cadre de
Now,
discussion
today,
puisque la Russie
there's no
a
framework for a
déclenché la
discussion
guerre.
because
Donc, il y a des
Russia
canaux
has
de
started a war.
discussion
So there are discussion
bilatéraux,
channels,
informels. Nous
bilateral,
avons à
informal in
plusieurs reprises
nature,
aussi décidé avec
and
le chancelier
on
Scholz
several
de discuter
occasions
ensemble
with Chancellor
avec
Scholz,
le
we have
président
decided to have a
Poutine.
discussion
Il a
together
toujours
with
refusé,
President
lui, de
Putin.
discuter avec
Now,
le
he has
président
always
Zelensky malgré les demandes de celui-ci et des
rejected
nôtres.
President Zelensky's
Donc, je constate
request
que
to
lui
have
ne
a
veut pas.
discussion with him. So what I'm
Le
seeing
président
is that
Zelensky serait prêt.
he
Mais il n'y a
doesn't
pas
want
de
to have those
format
talks. President
établi aujourd'hui.
Zelensky would be
Donc,
ready
le
for that.
travail que nous devons continuer
So
à
today
faire,
there's
c'est un
no
travail de
agreed
discussion.
format. So
Je
the
pense
work we
qu'il
need
doit
to
être
work on,
incessant.
the work we need to
Cette semaine, j'ai
focus on now
encore
is one
reparlé
about our
deux fois au
talks,
président.
our discussion. This
passé
week, for
plusieurs
instance, I spoke with President
pour
Putin
essayer de
twice.
construire
I spent
les
several
voies
hours
et
doing this
moyens,
to try
essayer
and
de mieux
develop
comprendre les limites, etc. À
avenues,
chaque fois,
understand the
en nous concertant
limitations,
avec le
the
président
constraints that exist. And every time there was
De
a
manière
consultation
évidente,
with President Zelensky, of course.
Les
And
négociations
quite
ne
clearly,
permettront pas de déboucher dans les prochaines heures et les prochains
at
jours.
this point,
Mais il faut
negotiations will
préparer le
not
moment où ce sera possible. Je pense que
produce
c'est
any
notre
tangible outcome
responsabilité.
over the next
Et c'est
days or
le seul
hours.
élément qui est
But
cohérent
we need
avec
to
le fait que
continue
nous
to
ne
do
menons
this
pas,
work
nous,
to
la guerre.
get to that situation.
Et que nous avons plutôt décidé
And that
d'une
is in line with
stratégie
our approach. We want to put an end to the
consiste à
war
aider l'Ukraine,
without
mener
taking
des
part in the
sanctions. Donc,
war.
il faut aussi avoir
So we
cette
have
foi. Le
these different
format de
avenues.
finalisation de
Now, when
ces
it comes to the
échanges
format
est
for the
encore à définir.
finalization of such discussions, well,
Et
that
il
remains to be
dépendra
defined.
du
It
choix
will
des parties prenantes, des
depend
demandes
on
qui
the decisions
seront les leurs, en
by the
particulier des demandes
stakeholders.
de
It will depend on their
garants
demands
d'accord.
in terms,
Il
for
est trop tôt
instance, of
pour les
guarantors
définir,
for
et
their
rien n'est fermé.
for
Et
these
voilà les quelques
agreements.
clarifications à la fois historiques et
So
contemporaines que je
I
souhaitais
think
faire en réponse à votre question.
that those are the clarifications I could bring for your question. Alzan Aran for CNN Turkey.
Monsieur le Président, et vous avez rencontré aujourd'hui
Mr.
avec le
President,
président
you had a
Monsieur
discussion
Erdogan,
today with the Turkish
qui, avant le
President,
sommet
Mr.
de
Erdogan.
l'OTAN, vous êtes
And
deux dirigeants qui ont un point en commun. Vous
You
parlez
have
avec Zelensky
a point in
et
common,
Poutine
which is that you
ouvertement.
have open
Et donc,
discussions
quelles
with
sont les
President
conclusions que nous
Zelensky and
pouvons
President
tirer de cette
Putin,
rencontre? Et
both of
peut-on
you.
penser qu'il
So
y a un
what can we
espoir
draw from this
pour,
discussion, and is there
revenir à la
some
table
kind
pour
of
les
hope
négociations et une
in terms
initiative
of
commune entre
reopening
les-
negotiations and
avec
having
les deux autres?
an
D'abord, vous
joint
avez
initiative for
raison
both
d'insister
nations?
sur le fait que le
Well, first of
président
all, you're quite
Erdogan
right
également
that President
parle au
Erdogan
président Poutine
is
et
also talking to
en lien avec la
President
question
Putin.
précédente,
And to go back to the previous question,
coordonne de manière
there
permanente
is
avec toutes celles et ceux
constant
qui échangent
coordination
avec le président Poutine.
with all of those who
qu'ils soient membres de l'Union
engage with
européenne ou
President
non.
Putin,
Donc,
be they part of the
c'était très
EU or
important
not.
que nous puissions
So it was
partager
extremely
notre vision
important that we
de-
be able to share
du
our
conflit
vision, our
et des
understanding
perspectives de
of the
négociation. Je crois
conflict,
que nous
and that we
partageons
understand
la même
the
lecture que celle que je viens de faire. Il y a pas de
possibilities in
perspective
terms
de
of
très court terme.
negotiation. I think
Et
that we
donc,
all
premièrement,
agree
nous allons
that
continuer de travailler
our
ensemble
prospects are relatively remote
pour
for the
chacun dans
time
nos
being.
échanges plaider pour
So
le
we will
cessez-le-feu
continue to work
d'abord comme première étape
side by
et la
side
construction d'un accord
to try to get
permettant
to a ceasefire and then
justement
to
de
an agreement
rassembler les
which will make it
conditions
possible to put together the various conditions which would be conducive to
Coordination
sustainable
entre nous deux
peace.
sur ce sujet et volonté de
So,
travailler ensemble. La deuxième chose, nous avons
coordination
décidé
and a will
de
to
pouvoir
work together.
travailler aussi sur
Secondly,
des
we have
opérations
decided to work
des opérations humanitaires
on
communes,
joint
en
humanitarian
particulier
operations,
à Mariupol.
in particular
Et
with
donc, nos
regards to
ministres
Mariupol.
et nos équipes vont travailler
So
ensemble
our
pour que dans les
ministers
tout
and our
prochains jours, nous
staffs will be
puissions
working
conduire
together
une opération humanitaire
in order to be able
ensemble.
to carry out such a
Éventuellement avec
joint
d'autres partenaires qui
humanitarian
souhaiteraient se joindre à
initiative
nous.
over the upcoming days.
Sur Mariupol,
We might
qui
be
est,
able
comme
to
vous
do
le
this with
savez,
other European
une des
partners that would
situations
want to
humanitaires
join
les plus
us,
tragiques.
and this
Et
would be
puis
about
nous avons
Mariupol,
également
which is
parlé
of
des
course
questions régionales et je
an
pense que
absolute tragedy. And then we talked about the
la
international
situation que nous sommes en train de
outlook.
vivre est aussi l'occasion de
And I
lever
think that the situation that we're
des
experiencing today
ambiguïtés,
is
en tout cas
also
d'être
an
le moment de
opportunity to
clarification stratégique que
come up
j'appelais
with
de mes
a
vœux
strategic
de la part de la
clarification. This
Turquie
is
dans notre
something which I
relation.
have
Et
requested
qu'il
from
s'agisse de la
Turkey
Libye,
in
du
our
Proche et
relationship,
Moyen-Orient,
be
de
it
pouvoir
with regards to
réengager
Libya
avec ses
or the
partenaires
Near
européens une
East, to be able
stratégie
to continue to work
collaborative.
or start
Je crois
working
que
with these partners once again.
le tour de vue que nous avons fait tout à l'heure
And I
avec le
think that
président Erdogan
the
montrait
discussion
qu'il y
that
avait
we had
la possibilité d'avancer dans le droit de
that I
fil
had
d'ailleurs de
with
la
President
conférence de
Erdogan
Bagdad
showed that it was
de
possible to make headway
septembre dernier que nous avions
following
tenue
up on the
et le
discussion we had
ministre
in
des Affaires
Baghdad
étrangères turc
in
était
the
présent,
fall last year.
de pouvoir avancer sur beaucoup de dossiers qui parfois nous avaient
Opportunities to make
séparés dans
headway
les
on a
années
number of
précédentes.
issues where in
Donc ça,
the
c'est un
past we
élément
may have
positif
been
dans un
a
contexte
bit
lourd.
farther apart. So that is something which is quite
Question
positive
de
indeed.
Adley Gamble de CNBC.
Adley Gamble from CNBC.
Thank you, Mr. President, and forgive me for speaking in English. My question to you would be, how should NATO respond if China finances and militarily gives aid to Russia, plus Total Energies is still operating in Russia? What is your message to them?
D'abord,
Should they stop?
alors, je vais vous dire comment je vois les choses.
Let me tell you how I see things.
Moi, je suis un esprit basique.
I'm quite
Et
down
donc,
to earth.
nous sommes, si j'ai bien compris les choses, dans
And
une
so, if
organisation
I'm not
qui est celle
mistaken,
de l'Atlantique
we
Nord.
are in an
Et
organization
de manière
which
basique,
is
je ne vois pas la Chine dans cet
focusing
espace-là.
on the North Atlantic region.
Donc,
And
pour moi, c'est pas un
with my
sujet de
down-to-earth
l'OTAN, la
approach,
Chine. Je vous le
I
dis très
don't see
sincèrement.
China being part of that
C'est un sujet
geographic realm.
d'un
So I
membre
don't think that
des P5,
China
la France
is
l'est.
a NATO matter.
On est membre
It is
permanent du
part
Conseil de
of the
sécurité.
P5, so is
C'est
France.
un sujet
We are part of the
stratégique pour les États-Unis,
Security
pour l'Union
Council.
européenne, pour la France.
It is a
Oui.
strategic matter for
Mais je pense que
the US, for France, for the
l'OTAN
EU, yes, that's true. But I think
vient
that
d'avoir un
NATO
électrochoc. Moi qui parlais
has just undergone
mort
a
cérébrale
big
en
shock.
décembre
I mean,
2019.
not too long ago, I was
L'électrochoc, c'est
talking
que
about
la conflictualité à ses frontières
being
est
brain
revenue
dead. Well, now
puisque
there's
la
this
guerre a
shock
été lancée
therapy,
par la Russie.
and we see
Pas
that
contre un de
there
nos
is
membres,
a new
mais contre un
situation
voisin proche.
with the launch of a war
donc,
by
je pense que c'est
Russia,
ça,
not
notre
against
travail.
one of our
C'est la
members,
carte que
but
je
against
montrais
one
tout
of
à l'heure,
our
c'est travailler sur cet
neighbors.
espace-là.
And
C'est
so
déjà
I would
beaucoup.
focus on the map I
Soyons
was showing
efficaces et
you.
crédibles sur ce sujet.
Let's focus on that. There
Ça,
is
c'est
already
pour
quite a
l'OTAN.
lot to do, and let us
Pour la
be
Chine,
credible on that matter.
Je l'ai toujours dit,
Now, turning to China, what I've always said
nous savons nos différences.
is that
Nous
we
savons
know
les
that there
éléments de
are
coopération.
differences. We know that there
Et
are
nous savons
areas
les
where
points
we
de
can cooperate,
Rivalité.
and we know that there are areas where
Je ne crois pas que la
we are
politique
rivals.
fiction, quand elle envisage le scénario du pire et pousse les décideurs
Now, I don't think that
à
focusing
essayer
on
d'intimider
worst-case
les autres par voie de
scenarios
conférence de
where
presse,
we try to
produit
intimidate,
souvent des
where leaders try to
des
intimidate
résultats
others
efficaces
through
recherchés.
press conferences is a very
Moi, je suis
effective way
plutôt pour
to
l'efficacité en la matière.
operate.
Donc, j'ai
I
parlé au
focus on
président
being
Xi
effective. I
il y a
had a
10 jours.
discussion with Xi
Je lui
Jinping just
reparlerai
10 days ago. I will be
autant
talking
que
to him
nécessaire durant cette crise.
as often as necessary
Et
in
j'ai
the
eu face
context
à
of
moi un
this
dirigeant,
crisis.
premièrement,
And I
qui
had
a partagé
somebody
nos préoccupations.
who
et qui
shared
désapprouve la
our
guerre.
concerns, who disapproves of this war.
J'écoute, je lis comme vous ce que dit la
Now,
Chine,
I
y
read
compris
and hear what
quand
China is
on lui
saying,
fait des reproches.
including when
La Chine
there's
défend en
criticism
permanence
against it. And
la
China
souveraineté des peuples,
is always
leur
defending
droit à
the
disposer
sovereignty of
d'eux-mêmes
people, their right to
et
deciding on
l'importance de
their
ces notions.
future, and how
Il est
important
donc
all of
tout
these
à fait normal
concepts are.
que la Chine
So it makes perfect sense
ne puisse
that
soutenir la
China
Russie dans une
would not be in
agression
a position to
contre un
support
peuple
Russia
voisin
as
et la
it
violation de sa souveraineté
attacks
territoriale.
a
Esprit de
neighbor
cohérence,
and
la Chine y est
undermines
attachée.
its
Je sais que
territorial
nous pouvons
sovereignty.
compter sur
And I
le
know that we
président
can
Xi en la matière.
we can count on
Deuxième chose, quand nous
President
lui
Xi
avons parlé
Jinping
avec le chancelier Scholz,
and count on him being
le président Xi
consistent here.
Jinping nous a soutenus
And then when we had a
dans
discussion
notre
with
volonté
Chancellor
de
Scholz,
demander un cessez-le-feu.
Xi Jinping supported us when
Donc
we
je
said that we
crois
wanted to ask for a
plutôt
ceasefire.
à une cohérence
So I think that there
chinoise.
is
Et je pense que la
a form
Chine,
of coherence there. And I
en
believe
tant que membre du
that
Conseil de
China,
sécurité des Nations Unies, en
as
tant
a
que grande
member
puissance,
of the UN Security Council and
faire
as a
autre
major
chose
power, has no choice but
que d'être
to
une puissance de médiation et de
be a
modération.
power that is going to
Et
bring
donc,
about
nous aider à
moderation and
convaincre la Russie
mediation.
d'arrêter cette guerre,
And so it will
ne
help
l'aider
us
ni participer en rien jamais,
in terms of getting Russia
veiller
to
à
stop
ce que
doing
toutes les
this war.
puissances, en
It is in
particulier
its
les
interest
puissances
to
dotées,
see to it
reviennent à la
that
raison et à
nuclear
la
powers,
stabilité. Parce que je sais
all
que
of
la
them,
Chine est
return
attachée
to
à une
reason
certaine visibilité
and
dans le
visibility.
cadre
I know
des
that the
relations
something which is important for China in the context of international relations. So I'll continue to talk to President Xi Jinping. In this spirit, I want to believe that China will be consistent in terms of its vision and its understanding of territorial sovereignty, so it will try to put an end to the war, and it is my belief that China will not contribute to any form of escalation. That is how I want to look at things. Would you be ready to take another question or two? Okay. Well, let's see how much time we have. I think we have time for two more. So Paul from TV Romania.
Mr. President, Paul Angelescu from ProTV Romania. Mr. President, France will be lead nation in the new battle group that will be formed in Romania. You have already sent troops in the last weeks to Romania for reinforcement. Besides the troops you have already sent in this context, should we expect an increased military presence on Romanian territory from France? And if so, also, will France maintain its maritime presence in the Mediterranean for as long as it takes, or maybe even increase it in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea in order to deter any possible threats by air or by sea? Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. On peut remettre la carte 2 secondes?
Thank you very much. Could we have that map once again? Thank you very much.
Exactement, je crois 550.
So I think we deployed 550.
Parmi les meilleurs, puisque nous avons envoyé des chasseurs
550
alpins.
of our best people, the chasseurs alpins. So they are there.
Donc,
the mountain infantry is present, and alongside the Belgian and Dutch units, and perhaps others will be joining this effort. But the idea really is to have a mission which can be scaled up. This is in the context of EFP. And I don't think that we need to change doctrines. I think that we can stick to the doctrine that we've been applying up until now. And as you can see, since February, we've been supporting the scheme in the air domain for your country as well as for Bulgaria. And there are means that are made available at sea in order to be able to use our planes as well as to continue our monitoring and surveillance activities in a maritime domain. So we're being pragmatic. Anytime we need to boost our effort, we will. And I think that we need to continue to take the same approach as the one we've taken over the past few years, for instance, with our friends in the Baltic region, with temporary missions. We don't want to change logics, approaches. The idea of a rotation seems to be a good one to us. That being said, something I want to underscore is that we are deeply attached to interoperability. So if we want these missions to be effective, what is important is that these different armed forces develop a joint culture and ability to work together. Now, on this map, you're seeing France's efforts, but there are also other allies who are contributing, of course, and all of that needs to mesh together nicely. And that is the purpose of interoperability. And so instead of increasing or instead of turning something into a permanent presence, we want to be as responsive as possible. And we showed that our responsive approach is credible. We've shown that over the past few weeks. So we want our presence to be temporary, but we also want more interoperability for the alliance and for our armed forces. And I think that Romania knows that it can count on France. Let's have one last question before the President goes to the European Council.
Thank you. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, a Soviet-made rocket fell on Zagreb, hit Zagreb, capital city of a NATO member state. Croatian government claims that it was bombed, that it was carrying a bomb. So I was wondering, what's your take on that issue? Was it an incident? How do you see it? What kind of message is NATO sending if such a rocket was able to fly through 3 NATO member states and their airspace, Romania, Hungary and Croatia? And will France increase its presence, air presence in the region, not only in Bosnia, but possibly also in Croatia? Thank you.
D'abord, merci, monsieur, pour votre question.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I was in Croatia just a few weeks ago, and in fact, we stepped up our strategic partnership, and we did that in particular in the air domain. There is cooperation between our armed forces as well as a program, as you know,
les Rafales français.
which
Ce qui montre l'engagement de la France pour
includes
la
France's
sécurité, y
Rafales.
compris la sécurité aérienne
So
de
that
votre
shows
pays.
France's
Et
commitment
parce que j'estime
to
que c'est la
security, including the
responsabilité qui est la nôtre.
security of
Et
your
c'est la
country.
cohérence. Je veux aussi
And
vous
again,
montrer
this is a matter
la
of consistency.
démonstration de ce que je vous dis depuis maintenant 5 ans.
Here we have a demonstration, an example of what I've been telling you about for several years now. We're part of NATO, interoperability. We're there when our presence is necessary. We step up such a presence, but alongside that, over the past few months, we've had an agreement with Croatia, we've had an agreement with Greece with regards to military cooperation and armaments programs.
Donc, nous sommes là aux côtés de la Croatie.
So we
et nous
stand
serons là dans la
alongside
durée.
Croatia, and our presence will be
Sur ce qui s'est passé
a
en
long-standing
effet,
one. Now, with regards
lors même
what took place
du sommet extraordinaire
And it took
que nous
place
tenions à Versailles,
during
il y a quelques
the
semaines,
extraordinary summit
dans votre
that
pays à Zagreb. D'abord, j'en ai été tout de
we
suite
had in
informé
Versailles
par
just a few weeks
le
ago.
Premier ministre Plenković.
And
Je
Prime
lui ai
Minister
témoigné de
Plenković informed me of this right
soutien à la
away, and
solidarité
I
de la
expressed
France,
the
qui
support
s'est
and solidarity
matérialisé
of
par
France,
plusieurs
and this
vols
translated into several flights,
à la fois de surveillance et
surveillance
d'intimidation,
flights, and
si je puis dire, que nous avons
intimidation
assumé.
flights that we
Donc, la réactivité
are
française
not
a
ashamed
été
of.
immédiate.
So
Les vols ont
France's
été actés
response was
quelques
immediate,
minutes
and
après
those flights
l'information qui nous a été transmise.
began
Ensuite, nous
minutes
coopérons
after
pour
the
pleinement
information was shared with
comprendre
us.
et attribuer.
And then we
Je
are
pense qu'il faut être très
working
prudent sur l'attribution
to
de cette
understand
explosion de
and
drones. Évidemment, on a
attribute
tous été très choqués
what took place.
par ce qui
We
s'est
need to
passé.
be very
D'abord parce que
cautious. Of
c'était
course,
sous
we
le
were
contrôle
all
à quelques mètres de
quite
logements
shocked.
étudiants.
I think that you would
Donc,
confirm that this was
on a
just a
tous
few meters
imaginé ce qui
away
aurait pu se
from
passer. J'ai vu les
college
images
students'
filmées par votre Premier ministre lui-même et
residences.
qu'il m'a envoyées.
I
donc,
saw
nous
the
continuons
footage
le
that
travail
was
en
shared
lien
with
avec
me
la
by
Croatie pour
your
comprendre
leaders.
ce qui s'est
And
passé,
so we're working
identifier la
with Croatia
charge
to
et pleinement
understand what
attribuer
happened and to attribute
cet élément. Il est apparu que plusieurs autres pays
action.
de l'Union européenne et de
And it
l'Alliance ont
appears
été
that other
survolés par des
nations
drones comparables
were also
venant de zones ukrainiennes.
overflown, if you will,
Je
by
pense qu'à ce stade, il
similar
nous faut être très prudents
devices
et ne pas
coming
tirer de
from
conclusions
Ukraine.
définitives
So at this point, I think that we need to be extremely
ces
cautious. We
opérations.
cannot
Est-ce que ça a
draw
été
any
des pertes
final
de contrôle,
conclusions.
des
Was it
détournements,
loss of
des
control?
erreurs,
Was
des
it
opérations
hijacking?
faites
Was it
à dessein?
mistakes? Or was it something
En
that was
tout cas,
done
les règles de
deliberately?
solidarité entre
At any
Européens et
rate, in
entre membres
terms
de
of
l'Alliance sont bien connues.
solidarity, the rules are
Et
well
elles
known,
seront activées si
and
besoin
that this
était,
would
de
be
manière
activated
évidente.
if necessary.
Et la France
And France
est une puissance amie
is a friend, is a
et qui s'engage
power
quand
that will
ses alliés, ses partenaires sont attaqués.
engage
Donc,
when
évidemment,
its
nous devons s'en
allies
tenir
and
sur ce cas
friends
précis.
are
Je voulais
attacked.
apporter
But
ces
with regards
clarifications.
to that
Mais là
specific
aussi, vous pouvez
situation
compter
you
sur nous.
raised, those are
La
the
conférence de presse
clarifications I
s'achève
wanted to
ici.
share
On
with
vous
you.
remercie, à
Thank you.
tous
This
pour votre
concludes our press conference.
Merci
Thank you
à
very
vous.
much for your time.
On continue.
Thank you.
De toute
Let's
façon,
keep
demain,
going.
il y aura une conférence de presse.
And there will be another press conference
Monsieur
tomorrow.
est en crédit.
So we owe this person a question. Thank you.